This is Tell Me Something Good About Retail with Bob Phibbs, the retail doctor. The champion for a more human connection in retail for over 30 years as a retail doctor. Bob is the authority on brick and mortar retail across the world, who works with some of the biggest luxury brands to independent retailers of all sizes.
Hey everybody, it's Bob Phibbs, the retail doc. I am glad you are here today for this edition of Tell Me Something Good About Retail. I get to speak with John Robison of Robison Service and part of the Springfield Automotive Complex. He's a well-known automotive restorer and a best-selling author on neurodiversity and human experience. His upcoming book will explore money, wealth, and security, specifically examining how conventional financial wisdom often fails people who think differently or follow unconventional life paths. And instead of just driving volume and discounting to compete, John is focused on full price selling, community building, and how to handle luxury customer expectations in a personable and human way. We're digging into how he builds community around his brand and how he trains his team and how he makes full price sales less about discounting. But he has had several careers. So in the 70s, John worked as an engineer in the music business, where he's best known for creating the signature special effects guitars played by the band Kiss. He's the author of his 2007 memoir, Look Me in the Eye, detailing his life with undiagnosed Asperger syndrome and savant abilities, and 3 other books. He has said that disabilities are problems, but that doesn't mean autism is a problem. He's been the neurodiversity scholar in residence at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. John, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for inviting me on. Yeah.
It's great to have you here. So let's start back. Can you tell us the story of how you got into the luxury car world and how that journey led to your belief that independence and community builds lasting success?
Well, I was not able to complete school because of learning disabilities associated with my being autistic. And most people who have autism, ADHD, dyslexia, most of us have a mix of several of those things because they are all neurological first cousins. And that package of things creates what we think of today as the neurodivergent population, with the people who are not that way being the neurotypical population. None of that was on anyone's radar, though, in the 1960s and 70s when I was growing up. So all I knew was that I could not do the schoolwork. And yet I was interested in electronics. My parents taught at the University of Massachusetts, and I had access to the UMass labs and resources, and I was able to teach myself engineering. And that led me ultimately to leave school where I wasn't getting anywhere and start work as an engineer for local music groups. And I was successful at that. First, fixing things for people, then building things, and finally creating wholly new things. Larger amplifiers, different sounds, different sound effects, and that led me to work with bigger and bigger bands. And ultimately, I became the engineer for Britannia Row, who was Pink Floyd's sound company back in the 70s when they set up an American operation. And that was where I met folks from Kiss, and I ended up designing all of Ace Frehley's guitars that lit up, shot rockets, blew smoke, and all that kind of stuff. So I became fairly widely known for that.
Nice. So how
But
did you get all of that?
yeah, that didn't tell you how I got to cars. So I I got to be designing pretty sophisticated stuff, and it got to where I needed more resources than I could afford or find on my own. And I thought, I should get a job with a company that is doing this kind of stuff, and I can continue to do the music like as a hobby, and I can pursue my interest in signal processing and making sound effects with some big company who wanted to do that. And at the time, we were just seeing the introduction of handheld video games, And video games, if you recall back then, didn't exist, but people were looking to automate what you used to play in a bar room, right? The old pinball machines with mechanical flappers to move the balls and bells and chimes. And so people were now designing little boxes with displays and dials that mimicked the flappers and the buttons in the pinball gallery, and they wanted to make electronic sounds to simulate the beeps and dings and all. And I thought, well, I'd be ideally qualified to do that because I did it for real on big stages, and that proved to be true. And I got hired doing that. And I moved into progressively more sophisticated engineering. I realized that not only would toy companies like Milton Bradley want that, and at Milton Bradley, we worked with General Instruments and Texas Instruments as chip suppliers. And we created the first talking game using electronic speech synthesis. We created the first game that used speech recognition. We created Microvision, which was the first changeable cartridge handheld video game. It's the ancestor of everything people play today. And those noises we created for them, they're still out there today. They've kind of became the default noises in gaming in many places. And so that was a really cool thing to do. But I went on to do more sophisticated stuff. I realized that, for example, rather than recognize speech for a game, there were government contractors that wanted to use the exact same skills, but they wanted to extract, say, a signature of an enemy ship or submarine from the stream of noise that underwater sensors picked up. So you had a lot of classified applications where they felt they had a really critical need to either make noises or recognize noises. And I found myself working in those kinds of systems. And I found myself going farther and farther from home. So by the 80s, I was in the late 80s. I was the head of power systems engineering at a company called Candela Laser. They made medical and military laser systems. Mostly what I worked on was military lasers. And I worked on signal processing and pulse power to run the lasers. So I was having to drive almost 2 hours each way to go to work. And I had always been fascinated by cars. I'd been laid off in the early 80s. And, I went from having my job to having 100 and some dollars a week unemployment. Wasn't much back then. And so I thought, I could just buy some old cars and fix them up and sell them while I'm waiting to get a job. And that got me started because I'd always had a love of cars. I had learned tinkering with cars and machines on my grandfather's farm in Georgia. And I had always fixed up my own cars. I would get old cars and fix them up and drive them. And I thought, I could fix these and sell them. And when I didn't have any other income, that seemed pretty compelling. And as the 80s went on, I began to see that that was a kind of a second career. I could do this as a sideline in addition to my work. And after a while, driving out there to Candela, and I was spending half my day on the road, I started to think, why am I doing this? Why don't I just try and make a business where I live? And I'll buy cars and I'll fix them up and sell them. And then I can be like a dealership. I can build up a clientele of people who buy the cars from me and they'll bring them back for me to service them. And that turned out to be a big step in my life because I quit my job to do that. And that was just after the time of, what was it, the savings and loan crisis, that 1987 stock market crash, all that stuff, happened. And the economy kind of tanked around me. But, I was starting my business from zero. So even in a bad economy, it was easy for me to get very high growth. And, I was encouraged by that. It was a struggle to actually make money. And I kind of lost everything I had in the process of starting, but I did get a business established. And ultimately, what I learned is that when you're selling cars, you're competing with dealership groups that, compared to somebody like me, have limitless resources. They're buying full page advertisements in the newspaper, buying minute long spots on television. So, how is a little guy like me ever going to compete with that? And the answer is we're not. And I realized, though, that I had a level of mechanical ability that was, founded some in my being a lifelong tinkerer and some in my being autistic and having an unusual ability to focus on things like that. And also my engineering education, which again was facilitated by being autistic and growing up at the university. So I could do things with cars most people couldn't. And I found myself in a position of fixing things other people could not fix, where when it came to selling cars, I didn't have anything really special to offer. I maybe I could go find you a good car of a certain model, but you could go across town to the big dealerships and they'd have 50 of them in stock, and surely one of those 50 would be acceptable to you. And and I wanted to build the business up. And I realized that the best way to do that would be to work on cars belonging to people who actually cared about them, because they were the kind of people who would appreciate that I had a better ability than most people to solve complex problems. And that led me into, at first, to work on Mercedes and BMWs and Porsches because I was familiar with them from growing up, and I had some experience working on them. I moved into working on Rolls Royce because my grandfather had those, those and Cadillacs and Packards when I was a kid, and I had some familiarity with that. And of course, Bentley at the time was the same as Rolls Royce, so I started working on all that kind of stuff and building a business. And and it turned out that I was able to cultivate a clientele who appreciated quality work. And it's interesting. That was almost 40 years ago, and now I've been doing this such a long time. When I started out, the dealerships all tended to look down on independent service people as if we were not really competent. They were really the authorities. But I've been Rolls-Royce and Bentley's technical editor for their national clubs for 30 some years. I write the technical standards now for those old cars, and people know me all over in that. And so one of my friends runs the service department at Bentley Boston here. And, we were talking one day about the conditions in our respective shops. And he said, Boy, I wish I had your customers in my dealership. He said, You work on cars and you do $10,000 worth of work on their cars, and they thank you and they say, It's so great that you were able to get it in and fix it. And he brings in a car and does $1,000 repair. And the guy comes in and he's outraged. He says, What is the matter with you people? How dare you charge me for this? This car is supposed to be in warranty. I'm not going to pay this bill. And the difference between us is that the Bentley dealership has cultivated a customer base based on leasing, because that's the easiest way to sell a car. So what they have found is they found a whole bunch of people who have the means to pay three, four, five, $6,000 a month to lease a Bentley or a Rolls Royce. And those people, by and large, have jobs, high-paying jobs, but jobs. And so they have a monthly budget. And that three, four, five, $6,000 fits into the budget. But when that car needs a $10,000 repair, as it will when it's 2 or 3 years old, that is like a major, major problem, because many of those people do not have 10,000 extra dollars. Whereas the people who bring cars to me are enthusiasts who own vintage cars. And vintage cars are expensive to fix. Nobody finances them. There's no leasing. So people who buy those cars already start off in a stronger position because for the most part, they had to have the means to purchase them, not make a lease payment. And the cost of maintaining them is a thing you expect if you buy a vintage Bentley as opposed to buying a new Bentley. So I didn't really think about it when I started the business, but now today I clearly understand that the model of a dealership where you lease stuff on a fixed payment is bound to cause you terrible problems in your service department when you have high unpredictable costs. Whereas our model, where we advertise that we do what other people can't do, well, if that's true, it probably costs more than some other things too, but we do it correctly, and that brings us a better match between our abilities and the clients. And that was one initial lesson that has served me really well.
Th-
That's why I came to be doing cars and not electronics, because
There's
ultimately it became successful.
there's so much to unpack there, my friend. And I was thinking about, you talk about the person who uh, respects the car, right? And I think about that. If you're listening to this, let's say, and you sell men's apparel, there are people that appreciate the way that the collar is fused on the inside. It's not something anyone else is going to see, but they appreciate it because they know how it fits on their shoulder, and it costs a lot more, right? Versus someone who just walks in like, oh, I'll take that, and they're not appreciating it and they treat it poorly. And I also want to unpack that you're talking about Bentley and Rolls Royce, which were known as well engineered cars, although there were things that certainly go wrong with them as they get older, of course. But and then also to understand that your focus on those details. In fact, that's probably why I should just let you speak a little bit more. But when you were growing up and you said you weren't getting out of high school, did we treat people who had autism or Asperger's syndrome? Did we treat them like they were part of the community? What was the prognosis if you were different back then?
The prognosis, if you were different like me, was that when I was 13 or 14 years old, I had a good command of language like I do now. And if you can speak well, people think you have decent intelligence and you must have decent intellectual abilities. And therefore, if I could not pass a math test, multiplying or dividing numbers, or I could not pass an English test where they were asking me to underline the subjects of these words in red and underline the predicates in blue, and use an adverb in a sample sentence, use an adjective, use a noun, use a pronoun, and I couldn't do those things, and yet they could talk to me, and I could create sentences and say them. I could do functional math to go through life. So their conclusion was that I was failing the tests because I didn't care about school, or I was lazy, um, or I was defiant. So they thought that it was a discipline problem, and it wasn't. If I could have passed their stupid tests, I would have. And I hated it, and eventually it just drove me out of school. So no, they did not treat that with any kind of compassion or understanding. And today, it's still the same in a lot of public schools. If you send your kid to a Montessori school or Waldorf school, somewhere like that, um, those folks very likely will investigate why you can't pass the English test but can speak clearly. And the other thing that I think my problems point to is that I did have a good command of language. So, what was the real purpose in having me underline subjects and predicates in different colors? Because the adult world does not care one little bit about subjects and predicates. What they do care about is whether you can construct smooth flowing, good language. And if you can do that, that's it. That's all that's required. And so we've had this problem for a long time in public school, especially where we teach methods and routines and we ignore the fact that the result is really all that matters.
Well, and I
And
would go
and
even
and that
further
was
and say,
I was a real victim of that, I'd say, as a person who was different.
and if you didn't conform, they had to make up a story about why it was that way. Like, well, he's just lazy. That must be it. It just needs
Well,
more
right. I
discipline,
mean, they
right?
right. They wanted to say, well, you're just stupid, but they couldn't say I was stupid because I had good language. I didn't, I sounded like sound like anyone else. So they said you're lazy and you're defiant.
Well, I think this is fascinating. And, you and I shared earlier how we share, because I'm a conductor, and you said that focused listening, not everybody has, very much like your focus, the way you can see into a project and see what most people can't. And I think that's ultimately what makes you the resource that you are, right? Because no one's going to you and saying, "Can you get me this little bulb?" It's, "Can you get me back on the road again? Or can we bring this vehicle back to life?" And I think that, you said something that community as wealth insurance. How do you create that feeling of being for luxury buyers in a world that's chasing deals? Like the difference between you and the Boston service people. It's got to be a very different mindset, right?
Well, the difference between me and them is that the service department there is established to support the sales operation because they are Bentley Boston, just as we have Mercedes Benz of Boston and Cadillac of Boston. We do not have any big facility like that that says they are Cadillac Service of Boston or Lexus Service, right? It's all about selling the cars. And the service is an adjunct to that. Um, so you are naturally going to have a complete focus on sales in those places. And in the service department, they have the same approach. The job of service is to sell. And so the car will have a maintenance schedule and it'll have these certain maintenances. And the manufacturer gives the dealership a set of prices and costs for cars. They give them a set of prices and costs for warranties and all kinds of common accessories and an accessory catalog. And then they'll tell them that this is the standard time we expect you to need to change the oil, to put front brake pads on, to mount new tires. And you can take those times and your labor rate in your local area, and here's our book of parts and our parts prices. But it's a job of selling. Whereas when somebody brings me a car, I don't get those new cars with 31,000 miles on them for 30,000 mile service. I get 30-year-old cars. And people say, "Well, John, I was traveling a lot and I didn't actually take my car out of storage last year. So the car's been sitting a couple of years and now it won't run. And I know it's overdue for service because it's been sitting a few years, but it also doesn't run. So I need you to come out and get it and figure out why it doesn't run and what we need to do." And often people will have us do that. And it's one thing to figure out why it doesn't run, right? Maybe the battery's gone dead and we put a battery in it. But then once we have a battery in it, we can crank the car up. Well, you can take the gas cap off and you can smell that the fuel has gone bad and the engine is shaking. It's not running right anymore. And you've got a problem with contaminated fuel. But not only that, maybe mice got in it and they ate a hole in one of your seats and you have a rodent repair. And so all those people are getting completely different packages of service. They all have completely different needs, and yet they could own the same make, year, and model car. So it's a much more complicated thing to do what we do here. And because of that, it doesn't lend itself to packaging well. Because these kinds of problems are more significant than just doing a routine service on a 2-year-old car. It's more expensive, and you have to be a reasonably well-to-do person to own and drive the kinds of cars we work on.
Well, that's great.
So
We're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsor, Sales Direct Plus, real world retail sales training augmented by AI role plays to make buying in retail stores more human. Hey, it's Bob again. I'm not only your host, but also the founder of the SalesRx online retail sales training program. How many sales that should have been yours walked out your front doors today? You know, with shoppers being more discerning about where and when they shop, you need to convert more lookers to buyers. And SalesRx is the perfect solution to make training memorable. It's bite-sized, it can fit easily into your schedules. Don't tell me you don't have time to train. If you can give them time to take a break, you have time for them to train. Now, the training builds from some of the quickest ways to engage shoppers to the most advanced. Everything is planned so you can implement your sales training program with a click of a button. And there's a reason we're on 4 continents training thousands, because SalesRx is scalable. Everybody learns the same new skills that will grow your sales. In fact, 83% of users report a double-digit increase in their sales within 6 months. Wouldn't you like that to be your story? Visit SalesRx to learn more and set up a call with me to see how we can help. That's SalesRx.com. Now back to the broadcast. All right, we're back with John Robison. And John, to build on that, we were talking earlier about, again, going back to price, because you don't work on price for an obvious reason. And it's taken you years, I'm sure, to have that reputation of trust.
Well, wait a minute now. It's not obvious what the reason is I can't work on price. And I think that's an important thing to tell people in the service industry. When you're dealing with a new product, a new automobile, a new refrigerator, or whatever, when that new product has a problem, there tends to be one cause. The car is leaking coolant. So there was a defective coolant hose put on it, or the water pump wore out prematurely. There is a problem, and there is a component that fixes the problem because the car's new. When your refrigerator has a problem, your refrigerator doesn't just need a systemic overhaul. It had a burner element fail. And there's, again, one thing that you fix. But you contrast that with what somebody like me gets. I get a 30-year-old car. I've never seen it before. Who knows what kind of history it's had of service? And when you're dealing with an old car or any kind of old machine, you cannot assume that a part broke and the car has a failure. Instead, you have to assume that this thing's 30 years old. So there are 1,000 parts on that car that have a service life that's probably 30 years. And obviously, they're not all bad today, but there could be many parts on the car that are at the end of their lives. And one part may have broken and caused a failure. But if I replace that part, there are these other parts on the edge of failure. And if I replace them and those break tomorrow, I haven't done you much of a service if I change one and then you come back with 2 more broken the next day. If this was a 30-year-old Chevrolet, most people would say, I'm just going to scrap it and get a new car. But people do not just scrap a 30-year-old Ferrari or a 30-year-old Bentley, or, they fix them. And so you're into these open-ended, hard to quantify jobs. And then it becomes a matter of your trust and credibility. The people have to believe that if you say this is what it needs, that's what it needs. And they also have to believe that if they bring you the car and say, tell me what's wrong with it, you have the skill to give them a complete picture of what's wrong with it, even if they themselves do not know what's going on.
And because you're not in a sales side of service, you're just in a autopsy side of service, which is trying to figure out what went on. Well, I love this. We could go on forever, but I've got to let you get back to your shop. Where can listeners find out more about your work or learn about your upcoming book, Getting to 1%, and even your shop at Robison Service? Robison.
Well, Robison Service is online at ROBISONSERVICE.com. And my newest book, Getting to 1%, will be on sale in the spring of 27 from Penguin Random House. It's coming from Portfolio Imprint. And with Penguin Random House being the biggest book publisher there is, I expect it'll be widely available. All of my books are available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the outlets online. If you want to find me online, you can search on my full name, John Elder Robison. There are many people doing all kinds of businesses who are named John Robison, but John Elder Robison is seemingly uniquely me. And I'm here at our shop in Springfield, Massachusetts. Anyone needs to find me.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for your time today, my friend. And again, that's so much to unpack about how we talk to people, how we build community, and the idea of being that trusted advisor, and how that loyalty translates when it gets back to you. I'm Bob Phibbs, the Retail Doc. Tune in next month when we have another fascinating discussion around what makes retail and service exceptional.
You've been listening to Tell Me Something Good About Retail with Bob Phibbs, the Retail Doctor. As a listener, you can receive free information and guides when you visit retaildoc.com and sign up for our exclusive weekly newsletter. Thanks for being with us. Remember to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you like to get your podcasts. To virtually bring Bob to all of your crew and associates, check out www.salesrx.com.